Thank you all for joining us for this in our series of brown bag lunches. We are here today with Faye Taxman to talk about racial disparities in criminal justice from police to parole. I'm going to turn this over to Harvey Ryder in just a minute. First, I just want to thank our partners. I am Vicki Fishman with the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. And we partner in this series with the American Jewish Committee, the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, SEDEC DC, the Next Gen Lawyers, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington Lawyers Division. So thank you to all of our partners. I want to logistically let you all know that closed captioning is enabled. So if that's helpful to you, please go ahead and use it. The chat function is available to you. Please use it to ask your questions. And we will be sure to get them. I know that our speaker will enjoy a conversation as much as a lecture. So please join the conversation by putting your questions in the chat box. And I just want to say that one of the things that I'm excited about for this program is it really goes well with a lot of the work that we do at the JCRC. One of our priorities is criminal justice, making sure that it is just. And I've done a lot of work in the past few years with the Virginia Coalition on Solitary Confinement, as well as working for other changes within the criminal justice system. And racial disparities are certainly anecdotally seen throughout the work that I do. I'm looking forward to hearing Professor Taxman give us more than the anecdotal stories, but some data so we can really understand a little bit more about the problem. And I'm going to turn it over now to Harvey. Oh, actually, before I do that, Harvey, you had suggested that I let everybody know if you put your Zoom screen on speaker mode instead of gallery mode, you will be able to focus more on Professor Taxman, and I think she's going to have a PowerPoint for you to watch as well. So go ahead, Harvey.
Thanks, Vicki. Thanks everybody for attending today. This is, as Vicki mentioned, one in the series of our virtual brown bag lunches. We hope not too far in the distant future that we'll be back in person. But in the meantime, I want to thank everybody for coming. And I want to thank my co-chairs who've helped us organize these brown bag lunches over the years, Rhonda Lees and Richard Bolton, who I think are online. And you have the bios of our speakers in the past, and you have Faye's today, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. I just wanted to say that we're really lucky to have Faye here. Faye is a professor at George Mason University, and also their director of the University Center for Advancing Correctional Excellence. One of her other tasks, volunteer tasks over the last few years, has been to co-chair the Jewish Council for Public Affairs Criminal Justice Initiative with Bruce Turnbull, who is also on the line here today. And I think Bruce will be speaking a little bit later. I've had the pleasure of working with both of them over the last few years, and Bruce is a retired, as he said, from paid legal work, but not retired from legal work. So I'll look forward to hearing from both of them, and we'll have plenty of time for your questions. I think we may take some of them up during Faye's talk, but also at the end. So Faye, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Harvey and Vicki, for arranging this. Let me put up my PowerPoint here. So as Harvey said, I'm a professor of criminology. Is this visible to everyone? And at George Mason University, I've been working in the field for, 4 decades. You know, I've done a lot of work in different aspects of the field. I want to start off the talk today by basically acknowledging that one of the changes in the field right now is a recognition that maybe we should be calling this the criminal justice, instead of calling it the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, because quite a few people have questioned whether or not the system is really committed to the fair and just administration, particularly how minorities are handled within the criminal legal system. So that's something to consider and talk through. It may seem like a small issue, but it's actually a pretty large issue. And there's great philosophical debates as to whether we should keep justice in the label just because it's aspirational and what we should be striving to, or we should recognize where we're at, and use this as an opportunity to really fine tune our legal system to better pursue justice and fairness within the system. So I've sort of structured today's talk. I'm going to give you some big picture of what the system consequences have been for people involved in the criminal legal system. And then I'm going to dive into different segments of the system to talk about our policies and practices that really influence racial disparity. I have a lot of material here, so I will probably not go over everything on a slide. I'm not a person that likes to read slides at all. I like to talk through them. And, as Vicki and Harvey had indicated, I really am hopeful that people will raise questions in the chat box and or ask the questions. So I want to start off by the big picture. So ever since the 1970s, our country is the United States has been on a love affair with incarceration. When I started graduate school in 1974, we had less than 200,000 people that were incarcerated. Now we're over 2 million people. And the impact of our policies that are referred to as mass incarceration policies, which is to increase the surveillance of people who have been involved in the criminal legal system, is tremendous. For example, 9% of the adults in the American society have been convicted of a felony offense. 38% of the adults have a criminal record, and 57% of adults in our country have someone within their immediate family that has been to prison or jail. Now, these are what we would consider indicators of the reach of the criminal legal system across our society. And they're indicators that really suggest that, being involved in the criminal legal system, again, when I was in grad school in the mid 1970s, you hardly knew anyone. And here today, the likelihood is many of us will know people who have had many different contacts with the criminal legal system, or people whose lives have been adversely affected. Just so you know, this is a chart that was prepared by a group called the Prison Policy Initiative. They do some tremendous graphics. No one can compete with their graphics. So you'll see quite a few of their graphics here. But I think this shows us that, we have issues in our country in terms of the criminal legal system. Now, I will suggest most people focus on incarceration. I'm going to bring in the community corrections, because whereas we have 1.9 million people incarcerated in jails and prisons, we also have close to 6 million people on probation or parole. And in many cases, that probation and parole system are a feeder to the incarceration system in our country. And, I'll put a plug in here, the most under-resourced part of the criminal legal system is probation services. And because of that, it becomes that recycling door, because we don't do enough really to facilitate helping people seek a drug-free or crime-free life when they are involved in the front end of the system. Okay, so this chart, it's a little bit confusing, but if you can see on your left-hand side, it says US population. And what that represents is the percentage of people in our country that are white. So we have 62% of our population are white. We have 17% of our population that are Hispanic. We have 12% of our population that are Black, 5.4% that are Asian or Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. We have 2.3% that represent more than 2 races. And then we have less than 1% that are American Indian or Alaska Native. Why is that important? Because if you flip to the other side of the chart, it indicates the racial and ethnic breakdown of people who were in prisons. And this was as of 2016. So you could see that whereas around 12% of the American population is Black, 34% of our prison population are people who are Black. We have 62% of our population that are white, and yet the prison population composition is 32%. For Hispanics, we have 17% that are Hispanic, and we have about 21%. And I can go through the rest of this, but I think this graphic is part of the story here, which is the imbalance in our society in terms of who goes to prison. And, you know, if I was going to do this on probation, we'd have a similar sort of scenario where you have an overrepresentation of people who are on probation who are Black. And so that, you know, that's a really important factor, is that, you know, the way in which our laws are enforced, the communities that we police or over police tend to be those communities that are minority communities. All right. So the other thing, and this is, you know, actually when this particular statistic was produced almost 25 years ago, people were astounded and the numbers have not changed. But essentially what, you know, some researchers at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is part of the US Department of Justice, they basically reported what's the likelihood that someone will go to prison based upon their gender and their racial and ethnic groups. And so you could see here that Black men, you know, 28% of Black men are likely to spend some time in their life incarcerated. 16% of Hispanic men are likely to spend some time incarcerated. 4.4% of white men are likely to spend some time incarcerated. And those statistics, when these were produced, as I said, a few decades ago, they really shocked the field, and it gave people pause about asking the question about why is it that we have an imbalance of minorities and different ethnic groups represented in our prison system. I'll just say about gender that, you know, whereas there isn't such an extensiveness of minorities being represented in having a likelihood of going to prison, these are areas women are the vastly growing population within our current prison system. So the question becomes, is this race, or is it social class, or is it poverty, or is it both? And this particular graph basically illustrates to us that, you know, people involved in the criminal legal system actually are more likely to come from impoverished communities. They are more likely to become involved in the juvenile legal system early in their adolescence, and that carries with them throughout their livelihood. And so what this suggests to us is that, you know, in many ways, the criminal legal system not only overrepresents people of color, but it also overrepresents our disadvantaged in our community. And I probably don't have to tell anyone on this particular call that, people involved in the criminal legal system are underrepresented with attorneys at various phases of the system, and particularly at the phase of the system that counts the most, which is at the arrest phase, at the preliminary hearing phase, at the beginning part of the system. Because what happens at the beginning part of the system, and I'll talk about this a lot more, has a big impact on how many people actually penetrate through the criminal legal system and end up in prison, jail, on probation and parole. Okay, so I had to bring this to our attention. This is what's considered the map of the criminal legal system. And why this is significant is because, when this was constructed, which was actually a part of President Johnson's 1967 Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice, it was the first time people actually looked at the fact that decisions that get made at different parts of the criminal legal system have a collateral influence on later issues involved in the criminal legal system. So, for example, we know that people who are incarcerated pre-trial, in other words, they cannot afford bail or bond, those individuals are more likely to get a prison sentence, and they're more likely to spend longer periods of time in jail than individuals who can bond out or who are released on their own recognizance, or they actually, are under some sort of pretrial supervision. But the mechanics of our criminal legal system are huge. And they're huge because they penetrate many aspects of our society. I mean, if you just look at the numbers below, on average, 911 calls around 240 million a year. Police have contacts with 53 million individuals. And, about 11 million individuals are arrested and detained in jail for a short period of time. 1 million individuals have a true jail sentence. 5.8 million individuals are on some sort of probation or community corrections. 2.2 million are in prison, and about 1.1 million are on parole. Why is this significant? Well, in my average undergraduate class, when I ask students about their experience with the criminal legal system, usually somewhere around 50% of the class will have some discussion about having been arrested at some point of their life, or about a third of the class will actually report that they have been on probation supervision, either as a juvenile or an adult. And that just really illustrates the degree to which, involvement with the criminal legal system is commonplace in our community and society. So I wanted to show this to you because it's important to look at what happens at each of these different phases that are, color zoned here, as a way of asking the question, what happens to people who are involved in the criminal legal system? Where does disparity occur? Where do we have unjust policies and practices that result in more people of color being involved in the criminal legal system, more people who are impoverished or have low economic means? And so I like to kind of think about these as different phases, but they're also different policy initiatives. All right, so let me just talk about a couple key overriding trends. First of all, in many of the criminal code categories, essentially the disparity that occurs at the racial level tends to occur with homicide victimization. So what that means is that there is no other criminal offense categories where victimizations have such a differential impact between Blacks and whites, Hispanics, Asians. But it is in the homicide area, and you can see that today in the newspaper reportings, where we see escalated rates of homicide in places like Baltimore City and in Washington, D.C. And we tend to find these racial disparities in homicide, and they've grown considerably since 2010. Another area in which there is disparities is really in terms of police interactions and arrests. So a Black individual is more likely to have an interaction with the police department, a police officer, and that could be anything from traffic stops to, some sort of, a summons or some sort of warrant that is, produced. The same is true with arrests. Blacks are more likely to be arrested than other individuals. And that may have something to do with the available resources in a community that we don't have enough, resources to divert people out of the criminal legal system, or the way in which we structure the resources for that precludes Blacks from participating. And I'll talk about that more in terms of diversion programs. Pretrial detention. So one of the areas, and this is an area of great reform interest right now, is in how pretrial services are used and the adjudication process, pre-adjudication process. So essentially, we know that Blacks are 3 times greater to be detained pretrial. Therefore, they're not sentenced. They haven't been convicted. They just can't afford the bonds or the bail amount, or there is insufficient pretrial resources to allow people to be released on their own recognizance or under some sort of supervision. But this is an area of great concern, and there is a number of efforts around to really try and address the disparity issues in the pretrial phase. In the phase of incarceration, we've actually made progress over the last 20 years, where the disparity between Blacks and whites are not as great as they were. And in most cases, the disparity of who's incarcerated in state prisons, has basically declined. The only category is Native Americans, who basically, are more likely to be incarcerated than other ethnic or racial groups. And then, I'd be remiss to basically remind us that mass criminalization has really led to more minorities having contact with the criminal legal system. And our tendency to basically, criminalize a lot of social order issues and disorderly, some people refer to them as broken windows issues, has really opened the gates of the criminal legal system. It's contributed to those massive number of people who have a criminal legal background or who have some exposure.
Faye, can I interrupt for a second with
Sure,
a question?
go for it.
So going to what looks to be the one perhaps glimmer of hope on these lists is the decline in the disparity. Can you, maybe you're going to get to this, but if not, can you talk a little bit about what you think has led to it?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words and then we'll get into this a little bit more. So, in terms of state incarceration, one of the things that has led to this leveling off of the disparities is actually the focus of attention in the probation arena on trying to improve probation services and use what's referred to as evidence-based practices so that less people are going to prison as a result of failing to comply with the orders of probation. So for example, in the state of Ohio, about 10 years ago, they basically enacted a regulation that prevented the probation system or prosecutors from incarcerating someone for a technical violation like, having a positive urine, failing to pay fees or fines, some of the other things that people kind of get into problem behavior when they're on probation. So you have less coming in from the probation door to prison. That's one. The greater awareness in our society about disparities, for example, the 101 crack cocaine to cocaine that was in our federal legislation, the reckoning of that, so that we're kind of trying to close the loops on things that were highly racially disparate, is also another reason. And also the movement away from mandatory minimums as sort of a sentencing mechanism. We haven't closed the total loop on mandatory minimums, but that's been a big issue in trying to do that. So those are kind of some initiatives that have sort of led to that leveling off. Vicki, are there other questions?
I have not seen any in the chat yet.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right, great, thank you. Okay, so I just put in the little map here of the system just to remind us that there is lots of discretion points in the criminal legal system, even in the community phase, where police officers oftentimes have discretion about who they arrest. And then there's discretion at the prosecutor's office about what types of charges are actually pressed against individuals. So the disparity that occurs actually is on these police interaction and stops, traffic stops that are more likely to occur for Blacks than whites. We don't have good national statistics on this. You have to look locally, but this, has been an area in which, there's recognition that Blacks are more likely to be stopped at traffic situations, and decisions are made to actually arrest an individual, and therefore they begin the journey through the criminal legal system. We have learned from a study that I'm currently involved in is that the more the concentration of the number of police in a particular community, the larger the size of the jail populations. And so, there is a connection here between having more police per capita than, in terms of what happens in the rest of the system. I know a study I did many years ago, there was a very high arrest rate in a community, which was a very small community. And we were quite puzzled by this because the rate of recidivism and arrests within this community were like 3 times greater than the neighboring community that was, twice as large geographically. But we found that the per capita police officers in that community was much greater than in the adjoining community, which helped us kind of explain why there were differential arrest rates and differential use of their jails.
So a question that's sort of similar in terms of if the police are there just more arrests? Somebody asked, how about the introduction of the resource officers in schools, leading to more minorities being introduced into the judicial system? Do you have data or information on that?
Yeah, so this is an area of controversy right now. In the 1990s, we started to introduce police officers as resource officers in schools. We thought that would be a deterrent effect. But in some school systems, those resources officers have actually, facilitated more youth having contact with the juvenile legal system. For non-criminal things like truancy or being late to school, maybe some disruptive behavior that is on the borderline between delinquent behavior and actually natural developmental issues. And so there's a controversy right now as to whether or not we should have police officers as resource officers. We also thought that the best vehicle for helping our youth understand the dangers of using illicit drugs was to have police officers in the classroom. There was many of you are probably aware of a curriculum called DARE. I happen to remember when my son was exposed to DARE, he came home and he basically goes, Mom, we had this police officer, he was talking about all these drugs. It sounded like it might be fun to try them. Right. And I quickly whipped out my head and said, no, let's talk about what happens when you do these things. But, we think these are well-intended, but in particularly concentrated disadvantaged communities where police, police have not a great trust with that community, the introduction of police into these other institutions can have some pretty negative effects. And the exposure of the police to kids and then, using the criminal legal system or juvenile legal system as a means of dealing with adolescent behavior also is sort of part of what someone call the school to prison pipeline.
Is that impacted when is there a correlation, I guess is the word that's being used, which I think is important, based on the demographic of the officers and the accused?
There's great debate about the whole demographic of police officers. I mean, the thing that we know most is that we haven't in the last 50 years made great strides in increasing the representation of minorities as police officers. I should also mention we haven't made great strides of increasing the representation of women as police officers either. These were actually recommendations in Johnson's 1967 report that police departments should mirror the communities that they patrol. But we haven't made a lot of good progress in that area. And more of the discussion, to be honest, is that when you are a minority in a police department, people have to adapt to the culture of that department, and therefore people become a bit more socialized. So I wouldn't say that we have great literature to suggest that Black officers in schools that predominantly Black is going to lead to greater trust amongst the population. And, I think that this is not an area that we're able to do a lot of work in because of the low number of minority officers.
There are two more questions, and then
Sure.
maybe let you keep going with your slide presentation. But one is, what about immigration status? How does that, are you seeing that as an impact in these issues that we're raising? And then the other one is a little bit more, I guess, politically oriented. Are you seeing with the pushback over the last couple of years over the concept of systemic racism, like there's pushback, political pushback, as to whether or not that exists, and whether that's a way of stopping conversations or starting conversations? Are you seeing that have an impact? And do you think it will continue to have an impact on local, state, and federal efforts to deal with these racial inequalities in the criminal legal system?
So the first question about immigration, what we know most about immigration is that, immigration rates in a community does not have an impact on crime rates. So people of immigrant status are not more likely to be involved in crime. They're slightly more likely to be a victim of crime, and also not report crimes as much because of their concern about their immigrant status. So, police arresting immigrants, we don't see that as great unless that immigrant is more likely to be Black. So that's the first question. The second question is to open up Pandora's box about sort of where we are with our criminal legal system reforms. In my perspective, to be honest, when we started to talk about defunding the police, it turned the attention away from really trying to think about systemic racism and the ways in which the criminal legal system and police departments work with citizens and communities. So, I think where we are is, we have depended, we in the US, we have depended upon the police departments to really address a lot of social ills, which isn't necessarily the purpose of a police department. So for example, we know that the largest concentration of people with substance use disorders in the United States can be found in the criminal legal system, all the way from arrest through prisons and probation. It begs the question of, how can, using the criminal legal system affect the likelihood that someone will deal with their substance use disorder, their mental illness. And what we know is that the legal system overall destabilizes individuals and does not adequately deal with someone's health issues. One area of work that I've spent a lot of my career on is really this area about trying to provide access to quality treatment services. And these are health services, right? And counseling services and medications. And, we have a lot of barriers that prevent that to occur. One I put up here is that in states like Maryland, and Virginia that have Medicaid expansion services, if you're incarcerated, those services go away, right? You're not allowed to use your Medicaid expansion services while you're incarcerated. And that really has a big impact on individuals, because that means if someone has a medical need and the prison or jail does not provide for that, they don't fund it, then the person actually doesn't continue to get the adequate care they need. There's some states like Massachusetts, who recently, a couple years ago, enacted a law that if someone was on methadone or buprenorphine, some sort of medication for opioid use disorders or alcohol disorders, and they come into the local jail has to continue them on that medication. If not, people oftentimes are taken off medication, even even people with serious mental illness who are on various types of psychotropic drugs. If they go into the local jail, they are often, that medication is usually taken away from them. And so, one of the innovations right now is really thinking about how could we allow for the use of Medicaid expansion funding while people are incarcerated. And from my perspective, we're doing a disservice to individuals when we don't provide that type of care. And that's one area of disparity. The issue about police departments is, there's a movement now to have what's called co-responders, police officers with social workers who can respond to situations. And the benefit of those are really the benefit of diverting people out of the criminal legal system who do not need to be there. And those diversion efforts, are far and few between. They're growing. We actually have a new term now. They're called deflection. So you deflect people out of the criminal legal system, but we need to be able to have the resources in our community to provide those types of services. And we don't necessarily have those resources available. One, two, we have a tremendous lack of a number of people who are qualified social workers, counselors. I mean, it's really, kind of a national emergency that we just don't have enough people in the pipeline who have the skill sets to help people with substance use and mental health sort of issues. So I don't know if I answered it totally, Vicki, but is there a
I think these are all ongoing questions, so I'm not sure you can ever answer it totally. But one thing that I just wanted to share when you mentioned the psychotropic medications, certainly in our work in the state and local prison system, that is obvious. When looking at solitary confinement, the impact of somebody not getting the medication that they need and then violating some behavior norm. Or looking the wrong way at somebody and ending up in solitary confinement, and it just continues the cycle of just being part of the system and it getting worse rather than better.
Right.
There are a few more questions, and I'm wondering if you want to keep moving on, and then some of these I think we can save to the end.
We can do more questions. I think it's if people have questions, I'm happy. I think we can discuss them, and if I don't get through this, it's not, there's a lot of material here. I can come back another time
and we'll circulate it. Right, we'll circulate it afterwards as well. Okay, there's a question here about if you have any information about why or your own analysis of why the homicide rate has increased so much in the American cities over the past 3 years. I think that takes us a little bit away maybe from the racial disparities, except that you did note that is where there are racial disparities in terms of victimization. And then while you're talking about that, let me also throw out one sort of global question that you might be able to address in throughout the rest of the questions also, is why is this a Jewish issue or a Jewish problem? I think that these are Jewish organizations who have sponsored a Jewish lawyers brown bag lunch series. If you could talk to that a little bit as well.
Yeah, that I love to talk about that one. And so let's go back to the homicide rate. Why? Well, first of all, the reality is the United States, we have more guns per capita per individual than any other Western or any other country in the United States. And the access and availability to guns, contributes to overuse and more fatalities. I mean, for example, in suicides, a good portion of suicides actually occur from people having access to guns. So our gun policy is very critical. And something that, it's so controversial, it's hard to get your hands around it, but it's really an issue. Why the homicide rate? I can't say that, I'm an expert on this area. I'm sort of more of a, trying to collect that information and try and think about it. But part of it has to do with the fact that we have such social isolation of Blacks and minorities in many of our communities. And those communities are, they have what's called concentrated disadvantage, just generations and generations of people not having access to basic services like healthcare, housing services, transportation, all of that, which just contributes to, people needing to use whatever means they can to survive in those communities. I'm not justifying in any way the use of the increased homicide rates, but I think we have not taken an approach to really do good violence prevention efforts and to work within those communities where violence is likely to occur. I think, one of the things what Bruce Turnbull and I, as part of our work with JCPA, when we were having a meeting across the, the network, and people were talking about mass shootings, and the proliferation of mass shootings in our country. And so when we ask the question about homicide, and we ask the question of why should Jews care about these sort of issues, I think part of it is because we're part of the community. And of course, now we know with increased anti-Semitism and many of these mass shootings that have occurred in synagogues or defacing synagogues, that if we don't deal with our social issues, we're just really going to contribute to continued disarray in many sense. And so, to me, part of the issue about, why I became involved in JCPA from dealing with the criminal legal system is, the criminal legal system grew out of a fear of crime in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, and that was uninformed. And, it seems to me that the Jewish community has the potential to really deal with some of this misinformation and help steer these policies in directions that would create a fair and just society. But you have to be aware of the policies. You have to know what actually are some of the drivers. For example, this question about Medicaid eligibility, expansion eligibility, that's not something most of us think about on, as, oh, if we change that policy, it would have a great impact in terms of helping people who are incarcerated get the adequate care, particularly for mental illness and substance use disorders. And therefore, we know we would have less issues with recidivism, and we also know we will have less issues with people's recycling through the criminal legal system. So, I can't fully explain the homicide issue other than, in my perspective, it has a lot to do with access to guns, and it has a lot to do with people not feeling that they are a part of our society. And I don't know, Bruce, do you want to add anything to why should Jews care about
Yeah,
this?
let me maybe jump in on that point. We put 3 years ago, we put together a group of people, professionals who worked in the area of criminal justice. They were not necessarily working as Jews, working in a Jewish organization. Faye is an example of somebody who came from that process. There were other people. The head of the Brennan Center's criminal justice program happens to be Jewish, but the Brennan Center is not a Jewish organization. But anyway, we said to people, what one thing could we do as a Jewish organization that would help you in your work? And what they said was, I want to know that what I'm doing is really from my Jewish values. So we put together a group of rabbis and we put together a group of practitioners who in the area, and we came up with a 2-page statement. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but we'll get that to Vicky and get it out to you all. Yeah, and that's where it is exactly. And it basically came through. There were a number of values that Jews find central to who they are that fit in why do they get involved in criminal justice. Now, the other point I wanted to make, and I meant to make it before, but is obviously there are many more Jews of color than people have generally thought. And so the Jews of color are people who in many cases are experiencing the racial disparities that Faye's talked about. But the Jewish values that we came up with, one was teshuvah, return, repentance, and restorative justice. Another was B'Tselem Elohim, everyone is made in the divine image. Another is that destroying a life destroys the world. When we destroy one person, we destroy an entire universe. The one that you probably are most familiar with, tzedek, tzedek, terdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue, which is not only should justice be pursued, but it should be done in a just manner. And so that's an important value. Another, hesed, balancing justice with kindness. Another, love your neighbor as yourself. Another is, and this is important as we reach out to all of you and others, silence is akin to complicity. Silence in the face of injustice is an active choice, a tacit consent. Allowing injustice to continue unchallenged is, in essence, committing the injustice as well. And those were the core values that we came up with, working with our rabbinical council and working with our practitioners in the field, and it's embodied in a 2-page paper that's where Faye's PowerPoint shows you where it is. But it is something that we found resonates. And I do a lot of work in interfaith work, where I am the Jewish representative or one of 2 Jewish representatives on an interfaith coalition. And I found that our value statement resonates with many people across faiths, and that it is very helpful in advocating with members of Congress, staff people for members of Congress. In Maryland, I haven't done so much in Virginia, but in Maryland, we've been able to come forward with these statements, and people go, yeah, well, let me think about that, and it's been very valuable. So that's my 2 cents and my 3 minutes, and I'll go back on mute. But it is something that we've thought about, and that we put together this statement here.
Okay, so I see in the chat box, I'm going to go back to where I was at. I see in the chat box, there's 2 questions, one about private prisons, and the other has to do with the map that I've done about the Johnson administration and whether there's any point where there's not evidence of racial inequities. So I'll answer that one first. There is no point where there is not issues of racial inequities, except for, the fact that we do see some leveling off in prisons, but we don't see any leveling off in jails. And the majority of people are exposed to jails. I'm not going to deal too much with private prisons. One, because a very small percentage, less than 2% of the prison population are in private prisons. The only thing I will say is that, private prisons, essentially do not provide for a standard of care, and that should be our major concern about humane care within any facility. But I'm going to sort of leave the private prisons because that's a whole nother discussion. So the thing I really want to point out is So if we want to deal with the front end and close the front end so that, we're dealing with serious offending behavior, personal crimes, things of that nature, we really have to think about what else should we be doing. And since we know that the majority of people arrested in the United States are arrested for misdemeanor crimes, many of them as a result of substance use or behavioral health disorders, we really need to be rethinking both the use of social workers and other types of first responders, EMS, to be able to help people, but also to really be able to build out our network of diversion programs or deflection programs. Now, a lot of people think, well, if the police, aren't going to arrest someone, then really we're contributing to more disorder in our community. But that's not the case. It actually, there's a collateral benefit, in terms of really trying to expand the number of diversion efforts. So I'm going to give you an example from a recent study that was conducted by three health economists. And they basically, were using an example in New York in which they looked at the non-prosecution of people arrested for misdemeanor events. And they found that by not arresting people for misdemeanors, they had a 58% reduction in prosecution for further criminal complaints for other misdemeanor offense. They had a 60% reduction in new misdemeanor charges. There was really no difference in felony charges, but they actually saw that there were reductions in violence and disorderly conduct and motor vehicle criminal complaints. And so by not using the arrest powers, but perhaps diverting people, using community service or some sort of restorative justice model where people pay back the community for the deeds that they have done, we can actually have some pretty significant collateral benefits here. And one of them, of course, is reducing the number of people who might have a criminal record, which of course we know will have some good effects overall. So, a lot of people are ambivalent about the notion about, deflecting people or not arresting people. But actually there is a lot of evidence that providing these extra legal sort of, opportunities helps us be able to better manage the criminal legal system. So one of the consequences of our current criminal legal system is, with 10 million arrests a year, it's a huge processing problem. It means that people with more serious offenses and behaviors kind of are under the radar, and therefore we're really not achieving the goals that we need. And we're actually harming people to some degree to be able to do that. So Harvey actually raised this question, and I'm going to turn my attention now to pretrial services. Harvey says, you mentioned racial disparities in pretrial detention. What effect do you think the recent elections in New York and the criticism of New York's bail reform laws will have on reducing pretrial detention racial disparities? So let me begin by saying that, probably one of the, I'm not saying this because this is a group of attorneys, but I am pointing out that, we have a terribly inadequate defense service system in this country. People don't have access to attorneys. And oftentimes they get access to the attorneys at the time of the adjudication, but it's really these pretrial phases where attorney representation can have a really huge effect on, helping people to be released instead of pretrial detention. And so, that is something that we should really think about. The problem with the New York situation, Harvey, and bail reform there is that because of the uptake in homicides and the uptake in homelessness in New York City, the bail reform got caught up in that particular scenario. And this is always the problem that we have with criminal legal system reform, is that it's easy to build up the fear of crime. I mean, if the recent news coming out of New York is that the election results were really, particularly in Long Island, had a lot to do with the ads having to promote fear of crime and concerns about, crime, in communities. So I think this is an area that we have to be thoughtful about, which is thinking about who should be detained pre-trial. In 1984, the federal legislation was very clear that people should only be detained if they were going to be a risk to themselves or a risk of flight, right? They weren't going to show up to court. Well, we know most people show up to court, to be perfectly honest. And so, the reason most people are detained are because they can't afford to get out of jail. I did a lot of work in Baltimore City, and it used to amaze me that people were, stuck in jail in Baltimore City waiting, funds to be able to get out on a $500 bond. But the family didn't have $50 to be able to put forward to that. So we really need to focus our attention on pretrial practices and giving people more opportunities there for release. There's good success with ROR programs. Again, most people do show up to court. And to be honest, people showed up more in court during COVID era because they could zoom into court. And I've had several judges tell me that people were much more relaxed than when they had to hustle into the courtroom, wait all that time for their hearing. So, hopefully, there'll be some changes in our court processes. But we do know, and this is a long known fact, that if you are in jail pre-trial, you are more likely to get a prison sentence, and Blacks are oftentimes more likely to be detained pre-trial. And then let's see, there's another question here. Bruce, what's your two questions instead of me trying to read them?
They're not really questions. They're just points that I make. One is that SEDEC DC is a great organization because it provides attorneys to people who have debt issues. And if you have a debt issue, that can quickly spiral into a criminal legal problem. But if you are represented, as SEDEC DC provides representation in the debt problem, then you never get to the criminal legal problem. And so that's a good organization that a number of you may be familiar with. The other was just, I was highlighting there's a documentary about a couple who founded a Jewish-based treatment facility in Los Angeles for drug and alcohol abuse and addiction. And they're a great couple, and it's a great film, and it's making its way around the Jewish Film Festival circuit. It will be available, I'm sure, for streaming at some point. But if you get a chance to see that film, it's great. Rabbi Mark Borovitz and his wife Harriet Rosetto, both terrific people.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Faye, how do you drill down the point you just made that if you're held before trial, you're more likely to end up with jail time after trial? How do you drill down into the why of that? And, is it the same issues? I mean, I guess your point earlier was the people who are held before trial, it's for the most part, it's because they don't have the money. So I guess that maybe that's the simple answer to it. It's not that they're being held because they're considered a danger to society. But how do you drill down to make that determination that it's not that the same reason that they're in jail ahead of time is the same reason that they get a jail term from the trial?
It's really based upon a case analysis, right? Looking at cases of people who get detained pretrial versus people who get released. And then, you know, I don't want to get too geeky here, but, you know, from a statistical standpoint, you have to control for the person's prior history, you know, because when judges make determination of safety issues, you know, this concept of, is the person going to be a threat to the community, they usually look at someone's criminal record. The unfortunate thing is because we've expanded our misdemeanors, you know, a lot of people with limited economic means tend to have more, you know, misdemeanor crimes on their arrest sheets. And therefore, they look more dangerous, if you want to use that term. And I don't mean dangerous here in terms of like, I will produce physical harm, but they look like, you know, that they will cause more disorder in the community because of the number of events that have occurred in their life. And so, you know, when you do the analysis, you actually control for how many criminal arrests that they've had, and then look at the differences in outcomes. Obviously, the nature of the charge also, but if you consider, you know, two people with shoplifting charges, right? And one is homeless and that person has 10 prior arrests, and one is not, you know, has more stable housing and only has 2 prior arrests, you know, the one that gets incarcerated is more likely to continue to get an incarceration sentence. And yeah, a lot of this has to do with the whole this explosion of misdemeanors. I mean, my most favorite unfair thing I always point out to people is, you know, I'll ask the audience, how many people have overdraft protection on their checking account? I do. You know, it's kind of normal, but you have to have enough money in the bank and enough of a balance to get that overdraft protection. Well, if you're poor and you're living on limited means and you write a check, you know, and you don't have the money in the bank, that's fraud. And that person can be arrested. Whereas you and I, we get a benefit. We get the, you know, the bank just sort of takes care of it because they have something they can charge it against, you know. And so those are the kind of disparities that we don't often think about, that exist in very subtle ways. But this over-criminalization and expansion of misdemeanors and how we handle misdemeanors. I know when I was doing the work in Baltimore City, and you'd have people, you know, who are in jail for shoplifting from CVS tuna fish and things like that. You kind of sit there and go, wow, is that a good use of the jail, or is there some other way that we as a society should be handling these sort of instances? And you know, I think that I think there's a lot of different things that we could do instead of using prisons and jails. Let's see. So we only have 5 more minutes or 7 more minutes. So, you know, I'm going to give Vicki a copy of this presentation. It drills down into a lot of different topic areas. So I go a little bit more into pretrial issues. I then go into prison issues and issues related to why we have disparities. I will say, you know, and this comes from my own work, that one of the biggest challenges is, and I spoke about this early on, is that we have a system in which, you know, the community portion of it, probation and parole, is very underfunded, and therefore, I mean, the average probation officer in this country has 100 people to supervise. We all know from our own work that managing 100 people is a very difficult task. There's been a lot of good work done to try and help probation officers deal with that workload. But one of the biggest things that we have here is we don't have enough resources in the community. We did estimates of what's the likelihood that the average probationer or someone who's incarcerated could get access to services. And we found that on any given day, only 10% of the population under the criminal legal system can get access to services. And oftentimes they weren't the right services, but they were some service. And so, we have a challenge in the sense that the criminal legal system is about building out the legal procedures, but the way we know to really cut recidivism, reduce victimization, reduce homicides, and to help people have a better quality of life is to really help fill in some of those areas that people didn't get because of their communities that they're involved in. So I think that that's a big issue. Yeah, Harvey.
Before we close up, I did want to ask one question of you and maybe Bruce, if you could talk about some of the types of legislation that are up for consideration in Congress that might tackle some of the racial disparities you've discussed today.
I think Bruce is a bit more situated. I will say that yesterday, the Senate and House passed the Justice and Mental Health legislation that does provide for some more demonstration dollars to deal with some of these behavioral health issues that I have talked about or alluded to. But Bruce, you're much more in tune with the George Floyd Act and other things.
Yeah, there basically are three things that may come up during the lame duck session in the next couple of weeks. One is increased funding for violence interceptor programs, and that the House passed appropriations bill has about $20 million more than the Senate Appropriations Committee bill does. And so I'd encourage you to get in touch with your senators to support the House version on that. Secondly is referred to the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Going back to the 1980s, there was a 100-to-1 differential of 100. Basically, 1 gram of crack cocaine was equal to 100 grams of powder cocaine in terms of sentencing. That's been reduced to 18-to-1 in the early 2000s. There's legislation that would eliminate the disparity. There's no reason for the disparity. That it is just a flat-out racial discrimination at this point. And that bill may come up as an amendment to one of the sort of must-pass bills. There's also a package of sentencing reform bills that have made it out of the Senate Judiciary Committee on bipartisan votes. The First Step Implementation Act, the no punishment for acquitted activities. There's a very bizarre thing, which is judges can add on to your sentence if you're acquitted, if you're charged with 3 things and you're acquitted of 2 of them, and you're convicted on the 3rd. They can use the fact of the 2 other charges to enhance your sentence, and this to add to your sentence, and this legislation would change that. And there's one other bill which had to do with COVID detentions and fixing an anomaly in an earlier bill from Congress. So that's a possibility. Again, I would encourage you to get in touch with senators. I had the occasion to talk to Senator Cardin about 2 weeks ago about these. He thought he was pretty positive on the so-called Equal Act, which would eliminate the disparities between crack and powdered cocaine. But we'll see. It's not clear yet what's going to happen. And all that is in the next 2 weeks because of the lame duck session. We also have legislation that's coming up. I'm not as familiar with Virginia, but I know in the Maryland legislature, there's going to be legislation on things like the use of solitary confinement. This is something where the JCRC has a really good policy statement. I'd encourage you all to get involved in that. Senator Lee from Bethesda is going to introduce it in the Senate. Delegate Moon from Silver Spring area is going to introduce it in the House. And it is something that has a good interfaith group pushing it. And we're hoping to get it through. It would install in Maryland the so-called Mandela rules that had been enacted in the UN for legislation for the use of solitary confinement. So I expect that there will be other things. You may have heard our incoming governor talk about at age 11, he had handcuffs put on him. And if you've read his book, you know that his mother took that and said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to go down that road. And she sent him off ultimately to military school, and he's proud of his military school background. And another person named Wes Moore didn't have that and wound up incarcerated for life for killing a police officer in Baltimore. And the book The Other Wes Moore sort of chronicles the differences. But I have high hopes for good things from the incoming administration working with our state legislature. And I probably have taken up all the available time, but that's
okay. So I will send a copy of this PowerPoint and I'll put on my email address, and feel free to email if you have any questions or comments. I hope that, I helped kind of fill in some gaps about what's going on, and also some ideas about different ways that you can support making changes in the criminal legal system. And I thank everyone for their participation today. I appreciate people showing up. So thanks.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, Vicki and Harvey.
I want to thank both of you, Faye and Bruce, not only for participating today, but also for the ongoing work that both of you do. On behalf of the other members of the Brown Bag Lunch Program, I want to thank everybody for coming. We'll have an announcement about some of the upcoming programs that we'll be conducting in the next few months. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Unless there are any other, Rhonda, I see you're online. Do you have an announcement for AAJLJ? No, she's shaking her head. Okay.
Actually,
anyway.
let me just make a point, since we were talking about the legislation. We do have next week. JCRC has our legislative breakfast on Tuesday morning. It'll be at Temple Road of Shalom in McLean, and on Friday morning it will be at Har Shalom. Is that right, Harvey?
Yeah.
At Har Shalom in Potomac. There are still some seats available at both events, so feel free to join us. It's an opportunity to talk about these and other issues directly with legislators. I know we have over 30 elected officials coming to the Virginia event. I'm not sure how many are coming to the one in Maryland, but they do want to hear what's important to us. And this is definitely one of the issues that's on our agenda. So please, if you don't already have tickets, you can get them at jcouncil.org. And I would love to see you bright and early Tuesday morning for locks and legislators.